Hi, everybody. Good morning or good evening, depending on where you are. Thanks to all of you, all the attendees joining us today for this webinar session, and to all those who responded to the corporate standard and scope 3 surveys. By way of introduction, I'm Pankaj Bhatia, Global Director of Greenhouse Gas Protocol at WRI, the World Resources Institute. We are truly excited to see so many folks in attendance. And we will be recording this session for those who are unable to join us live. I think we are going to wait for a few seconds, maybe 30 seconds or so, to let people join the session. And then we will dive into today's content. And while we're waiting, I would also like to express thanks and gratitude to all who supported us with wonderful feedback. Our apologies that it has taken us some time to share these webinars, these summaries. It was a painstaking work. There were a lot of details for us to digest and to bring them into concise summaries. And while you will see that today we present some high-level messages, which many of you may find confirm your expectations about some of the major themes of updates that we have been also finding through various conversations, informally or formally, that need to occur in the corporate standard and scope 3. And so you may see some of those common themes have emerged or have been confirmed, and there may be some new points also. And also, you will see that we are only able to present high-level overview at this point, but we will also share a lot more specific details in subsequent documents. I think we can now start the event. Next slide, please. As you can see here in the agenda, the GHG Protocol team will be sharing some top-line findings from the corporate standard and scope 3 surveys and proposals. Between November 2022 and March 2023, we invited the public to provide feedback on the current suite of corporate standards and guidance, including the corporate standard, scope 2 guidance, scope 3 standard, and scope 3 calculation guidance and market-based approaches. If you were not able to attend our webinar on top-line findings from the scope 2 survey, you can find the recording and detailed summary of findings on our GHG Protocol website. After today's presentation, we will also host an additional webinar on our findings from the market-based accounting survey. We will communicate the date of that webinar in the coming month. We're aiming to save time at the end of the webinar for a Q&A session. So if you have any questions throughout the presentations, please feel free to add them via the questions function. But please note, we have already received a great deal of questions via the registration form. And so very likely we will not be able to get through everyone's questions in this call today. I would also like to acknowledge and recognize overall the GHG Protocol team that has been behind this work, including our team members from WRI and our partner institution, WBCST. I think we will be sharing also details about how the GHG Protocol Secretariat now is being professionalized and it is expanding, given the huge demand that we see on our products and services. We are expanding our teams. About 2 years back, we were maybe 3 or 4 team members in the GHG Protocol Secretariat. And presently, we are about 30 team members. So this is also a sign of the success, but it is also a sign of huge responsibility that we have on our shoulders in terms of the standards that we need to update, and also many other products that are expected to come in the coming years. Next slide, please. For those of you who are less familiar with greenhouse gas protocol, because we know there has been a huge turnout, tremendous participation, and it is possible that many of you are not so familiar with the greenhouse gas protocol. The GHG protocol is co-convened by WRI, World Resources Institute, and World Business Council for Sustainable Development. GHG protocols, greenhouse gas emissions accounting and reporting standards serve as the foundation for most climate programs, including the Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP, and the Science-Based Target Setting Initiative, as well as many, many other programs globally. And I think I already mentioned that as GHG protocol undertakes this updates process for the corporate suite of standards and guidance, our team is growing, and we are excited about continuing build up in the team capacity, because I think we will feel a lot more satisfied. Presently, we find that many times we are not able to respond to your questions in time. And it's somewhat dissatisfactory for us and many of you also. And we hopefully, if we with larger team capacity, will be also providing much more timely responses. Next slide, please. So the greenhouse gas protocol was convened. Co-conveners are WRI, WBCSD, as I mentioned earlier, was convened in 1998. It started in 1998, and since its beginning in 1998, it is now 24 years old. We will be entering the 25th year very soon. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol has published a number of global standards, as you can see here in the picture. In the last 20 years, the Corporate Accounting and Reporting Standard, the Scope 2 guidance, the Scope 3 standard, the Product Lifecycle Accounting Standard, the Global Protocol for Cities, and then also 2 standards focus on countries, Policy and Action Standard, and Global Mitigation Goals Standard. And now in the present process, we will be focusing on the corporate suite of standards. So this update process is focused only on the GHG Protocol suite of corporate standards, namely the corporate accounting and reporting standard published in 2004, the Scope 2 guidance, and the Scope 3 standard. And I think they're important, very, very important guidelines or criteria, if I may say, to guide us in the process, although there are a lot more details, but at least I would like to mention 2 of them, very important, that our updates will focus on as we go through the revisions process. Our goal is to provide a very rigorous accounting foundation for business to measure and track progress towards science-based and net zero targets in line with the global 1.5 degrees centigrade goal. And then second objective is that throughout this process, we will also seek harmonization and alignment with major climate disclosure and target setting initiatives. The GHG Protocol Secretariat, as many of you know, is also currently working on developing a new land sector and removals guidance. And this draft guidance was published in 2022, the pilot draft, and the final guidance is expected to be published in 2024. Next slide, please. And this is my final slide. So I think many of you also have questions about the process that we are going to follow. Right now, the GHG protocol is in the process of developing work plans for 4 work streams corresponding to the 4 stakeholder survey topics, while also simultaneously finalizing plans for a revamped governance structure that will include new governance bodies. I think many of you are familiar with the GHG protocol multi-stakeholder process. In the last 20+ years, we have been successfully and very effectively following this multi-stakeholder process that has its own governance bodies. But generally, our approach has been that we convene the governance process when we are ready to start a new standard or to update an existing standard. And it has worked quite well. We have seen that how stakeholders have accepted the GHG protocol standards. But now in the new phase of the GHG protocol, what we envision in terms of the governance process is to have a lot more permanence in some of our governing bodies. So we will likely have a more permanent steering committee or a board, so to speak, of the GHG Protocol Center. We will also likely have an independent standards board that will make the decisions on the standards. We will have technical working groups, like we presently also have, that will work that will mainly focus on drafting the text of the standards. And all these three bodies will closely work, or actually I should say the GHG Protocol Secretariat will closely work with all these three groups, the technical working group, the independent standards board, and the steering committee. We will closely work with them, support them, and make sure that our new governing systems are very rigorous and very effective, and also can make decisions in a lot more timely manner. So I think just to conclude that, as you see here in the process slide, we are presently in the phase of the second block here, developing work plans and forming governing bodies. We expect to launch the multi-stakeholder process in the beginning of 2024, and we expect to complete the updates in 2 years, so 2024 and 2025. And we plan to finalize and publish the updated standards and guidance by the end of 2025. So let me stop here. Let me express my thanks to all of you again for your support, for your guidance, for your inputs, and for your collaboration in the future phases as well. Let me now hand it over to David Rich, who will take us through the next segment of the webinar today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pankaj, and hello, everyone. I will now explain the process we went through to collect survey input. We collected stakeholder input between November 22 and March 2023 through 4 online surveys related to the following standards, guidance, and topics: a corporate standard, Scope 2 guidance, Scope 3 standard, and Scope 3 calculation guidance, and market-based accounting approaches. So through these 4 surveys, we've received approximately around 350 to 400 responses per survey, and also invited participants to submit proposals if they would like on any accounting topics, and received over 230 proposals. We have previously summarized Scope 2 guidance top-line findings in a previous webinar. Today, we're summarizing top-line findings for the corporate standard and Scope 3 surveys. And our next webinar will be focused on summary of the market-based accounting approaches survey. The purpose of the survey was to collect feedback from stakeholders to understand user needs and identify gaps, which may warrant clarifications, additional guidance, or updates. We would like to note that the scope of work for the updates process is still to be determined in consultation with the governance bodies that Pankaj just mentioned. We've received quite a large amount of feedback, as you'll see in the slides, and we think there will be a need for prioritization and sequencing to figure out the exact scope of work. That will be communicated subsequently to today. Today, we're just sharing what we're seeing and hearing in the survey feedback that we received. Next, please. This slide shows a breakdown of who responded to the survey by region, organization type, and sector for both the corporate standard survey on the top and the Scope 3 survey on the bottom. In terms of regional representation, the largest group was from Europe, followed by North America, and then Asia and South America. By organization type, the largest group of respondents was from companies, followed by consultants, industry groups, and NGOs. And by sector, the largest group was professional and technical services, followed by energy, manufacturing, finance, utilities, and several other sectors. Next, please. Okay, so now we'll move to summarizing key findings from the corporate standard survey and proposals. So for the corporate standard, the top line findings are that most survey respondents express satisfaction, either somewhat satisfied or very satisfied with the corporate standard. Most survey respondents expressed that minor updates are needed to the corporate standard rather than major updates. While many acknowledge the success of the corporate standard, many survey respondents highlighted the need to further enable consistent and comparable greenhouse gas emissions disclosures. For example, where the standard now provides optionality and flexibility. And two issues that came through in this regard were organizational boundaries and operational boundaries. Right now, the corporate standard for organizational boundaries allows a choice of 3 methods: equity share, financial control, and operational control to define a company's organizational boundaries. Some have said there should be fewer options available to lead to more consistent and comparable inventories. On operational boundaries, the corporate, this is with regard to what scopes of emissions are included in the inventory, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and what sources and sinks are included in the inventory boundary. Some have said that scope 3 should be made required rather than optional under this corporate standard to enable more consistent, comparable, and complete emissions reporting. These are just 2 examples, and we'll give more details in just a minute. Respondents also highlighted the need to enhance alignment and harmonization with regulatory and voluntary greenhouse gas reporting programs, target setting programs, and the latest financial accounting standards. And I want to emphasize that if we reconsider topics such as organizational boundaries and operational boundaries, it will be with a view toward increased alignment and harmonization with other programs and standards rather than creating divergence. So we would very much give weight to how these issues are being addressed in other programs and standards. Respondents also highlighted the need to integrate the multiple greenhouse gas protocol corporate level standards and guidance into a single standard with multiple parts to improve user friendliness and have a single level of conformance for companies following greenhouse gas protocol, rather than having multiple standards and guidance to select from, as is the case at the moment. So those are some of the key top-line findings. Now I'd like to hand it over to my colleague, Steve Siravo, who will go into more detail on the corporate standard survey findings.
All right. Thank you, David and Pankaj, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. We're very excited to share these results today. So listed here are the 6 key topic areas of feedback we received in the corporate standard survey. Again, as David mentioned, we'll plan to release a detailed written summary sometime after this webinar. The listing is a summary of key topic areas and not a detailed listing of all feedback received. So starting with the first topic, which is more general cross-cutting feedback related to the governance of the standards, how the standards are organized, and how they align with the other standards and reporting programs. Topics 2 through 5 were more narrowly focused on specific foundational elements of the corporate standard, including organizational boundaries, or how organizations select an approach for consolidating GHG emissions, operational boundaries, or how organizations identify emissions within its operations, categorize them as direct and indirect emissions, and chooses the scope of accounting and reporting for the indirect emissions, tracking emissions over time, or how organizations choose a base year, recalculate base year emissions, and set a significance threshold for recalculation, verification or assurance, or how organizations obtain a third-party assessment of the completeness and accuracy of reported GHG information, and whether that information is prepared in accordance with the GHG Protocol corporate standard. Topic 6 is more granular feedback that we received related to data quality, or the types of activity data sources used to calculate emissions, methodology for calculating emissions, and reporting requirements for reporting a GHG emission statement in accordance with the GHG Protocol corporate standard. Next slide, please. Okay, starting with governance, we heard feedback suggesting a more formalized governance structure over the GHG Protocol. This included setting up independent oversight of the GHG Protocol, creating more formalized operational practices and policies in the process of standard development and standard updates, enhancing transparency with stakeholders, creating formalized interpretations as technical matters arise, and more responsiveness, especially as user needs continue to evolve. As discussed earlier by David and Pankaj, we are actively working to form our governance bodies, which we believe will address many of these concerns. We also heard feedback on how the GHG Protocol standards and guidance were organized. So this included suggestions to consolidate the standards and guidance documents into a single document to be more user-friendly, and also incorporating a numbering system for the standards with potential for codification, very much similar to how financial accounting standards are organized for ease of reference and ease of updating. The last overarching theme we heard was suggestions for greater alignment. First, there was feedback to address specific inconsistencies between the GHG Protocol standards themselves. Second, we received many suggestions to collaborate, harmonize, and enable interoperability, both with reporting, voluntary reporting standards, and target setting programs, such as ISO, CDP, GRI, SBTI, and then also regulatory reporting programs, such as the ISSB, CSRD, and the SEC's proposed climate rule. On that last point, we heard feedback on instances where the standards have outdated references to other programs, but we also heard the perspective that full alignment may not be appropriate in some cases, acknowledging the fact that other reporting programs may have different objectives and different sets of stakeholders, and therefore a need for collaboration with those programs and harmonization to enable interoperability and reduce divergences where possible. Next slide, please. Moving on to organizational boundaries. So first, I'm going to start with what the current requirements say within the corporate standard. The corporate standard requires companies to account for their consolidated GHG data according to either the equity share or control approaches. And a quick definition on the approaches. Under the equity share approach, a company accounts for GHG emissions from operations according to its share of equity in the operation. Under the control approaches, a company accounts for 100% of the GHG emissions from operations which it has control. And then control can be defined either by financial control or operational control. Under the financial control approach, the company has financial control over the operation if it has the ability to direct the financial and operating policies and gains economic benefits from its activities. Under the operational control approach, the company has operational control over an operation if it has full authority to introduce and implement its operating policies at the operation. So we heard a few different suggestions here from those who wanted to revisit organizational boundaries. The first was to shift from having 3 consolidation options to requiring a single consolidation approach. This would help enable consistency and comparability across organizations. The second was adjusting the existing approaches to align with financial accounting for consolidation and leased assets. So we heard the feedback that terminology used in the corporate standard was outdated compared to the terminology used in financial accounting for IFRS or US GAAP. It was also suggested we adjust existing approaches to directly align with the voluntary and regulatory reporting programs. And lastly, there were many suggestions to provide more guidance related to leased asset classification, how to evaluate different approaches, and to provide updated examples. Those against revisiting organizational boundaries often cited the need to maintain flexibility and enable interoperability for voluntary and regulatory reporting usage. Next slide, please. Okay, on operational boundaries. So after an organization sets its organizational boundaries, it then sets its operational boundaries. This involves identifying emissions associated with its operations, categorizing them as indirect or direct emissions, and choosing the scope of accounting and reporting for the indirect emissions. The corporate standard defines 3 scopes for GHG accounting and reporting purposes. Scope 1 emissions, which are the direct emissions from sources that are owned or controlled by an organization. Scope 2 emissions, from the generation of purchased energy consumed by the organization, and scope 3 emissions, which are optional for organizations to report for all other indirect emissions. Respondents in favor of revisiting revisiting operational boundaries often suggested a few variations of required scope 3 reporting. Some suggested making scope 3 emissions reporting for all categories required for all organizations. Some suggested requiring scope 3 reporting only for relevant and significant categories. Others suggested requiring scope 3 if it was a material amount of an organization's total emissions, or requiring scope 3 for larger organizations or specific sectors, or phased in to be required after a number of years of reporting. Respondents also requested more guidance related to leased asset classification, so specifically clarification of direct and indirect emissions in lessee and lessor relationships, but also for franchises, for licenses, for fuel and energy related activities. And lastly, respondents suggested more sector specific and use case specific guidance with updated examples. Those against revisiting operational boundaries often reference the need for organizations to maintain flexibility, to limit the burden on organizations, and to lower the barrier to entry for newer organizations that are just getting started in their process. Next slide, please. So tracking emissions over time, this is the chapter of the corporate standard that introduces the concepts of a base year or a target year, which is a year chosen as a meaningful and consistent comparison of emissions over time. It's often used as the basis for setting and tracking progress towards a target. The chapter also introduces the concept of recalculating base year emissions due to structural changes, changes in methodology, improvements in data, and discovery of errors. And it also introduces the concept of a significance threshold that is set by an organization and used to assess for triggers for doing a base year recalculation. So we received feedback on a few specific elements of this chapter, including suggestions to require base year consistency across all scopes, suggestions to require a set or defined significance threshold for organizations to use, and for consistent application and better comparability across organizations. We heard the suggestion to adjust the base year recalculation requirement to apply to all years presented in the GHG statement and not just the base year for better progress tracking. We also heard the feedback for more guidance, specifically related to the year chosen as a base year, changing a base year, more guidance on the application of recalculation, whether that recalculation applies to all scopes or all categories. And specifically for structural changes or acquisitions, we heard the request for more guidance on how to recalculate base year if historical information is not available for the newly acquired entity. We heard feedback for more guidance related to instances where there were multiple items below a significance threshold that aggregate to a significant amount over time, and more guidance around emission factor changes, global warming potential changes, and data quality changes that may have a significant impact on the inventory and therefore trigger a base year recalculation. Those against changing this chapter often reference the need for organizations to have flexibility and to better enable progress tracking. Next slide, please. Okay, verification and assurance. Again, this is how organizations obtain a third-party assessment of the completeness and accuracy of reported GHG information and whether the information was prepared in accordance with the GHG Protocol corporate standard. The corporate standard does not currently require any form of verification or assurance, and respondents providing feedback in favor of revisiting this topic often suggested some form of verification or assurance requirement. So requiring it over all scopes, requiring verification or assurance over just scope 1 and 2, requiring verification or limited assurance or reasonable assurance. So it's a few different variations on the type of assurance required. requiring verification or assurance annually or every other year or every 3 years, or requiring it for larger organizations or specific sectors, or using a phased-in approach. Respondents also suggested providing more guidance, specifically related to the appropriate verification or assurance standards, such as the AICPA attestation standards, the ISA standards, the ISO standards. We understand there are many standards currently being used. Respondents suggested providing more guidance on the qualifications for an appropriate third-party verifier or assurance provider, and if they need to be independent of the organization. And respondents also suggested providing more guidance on how organizations can prepare in advance of obtaining that third-party assurance or verification. On the other side, respondents against revisiting this chapter suggested that regulatory organizations are already implementing assurance requirements, and therefore the GHG protocol implementing these requirements could be an added burden on organizations and also a higher barrier to entry for newer organizations. Next slide, please. Okay, on to our sixth topic. Starting with data quality and methodology, we heard the feedback suggesting adding data quality requirements and more guidance related to the types of source data and the use of actual data versus proxy data for estimates. We heard suggestions to implement emission factor and global warming potential requirements and more guidance related to the specificity on which emission factors and global warming potentials are appropriate for use. We heard suggestions to add requirements and guidance for when subsequent information becomes available. And we heard feedback to update the approach for biogenic carbon, for removals, for new technologies, both new measurement technologies and new decarbonization technologies. On reporting, we heard feedback asking for more prescriptive reporting requirements, specifically related to choosing a base year, updating a base year, or recalculating base year emissions. We heard feedback asking for requirements to disclose the significant threshold set by an organization and disclosing the triggers for a base year recalculation. Feedback also included suggestions for more reporting requirements related to disclosing sources of data, disclosing significant estimates, and distinguishing estimates from actual data. Feedback asking for requirements for disclosing subsequent events or subsequently available information, and for disclosing exclusions from an organization's inventory. Next slide, please. Okay, so we just covered a summary of what we learned in the survey responses. Now we'll briefly shift to the proposals. We received a number of proposals, and the proposals that were submitted with attribution are available for review on our website. To focus on one of the near-term next steps in the update process, there were roughly 40 proposals that were specific or self-identified to the corporate standard. It's important for folks to start to dig into some of these proposals, digest some of the proposed changes presented, and bring a critical eye to them. Many of these could help form the basis for future changes in the corporate standard. We hope to use these proposals to inform our update process, and we plan to begin assessing how they align with the existing GHG protocol principles around accuracy, transparency, completeness, relevance, and consistency. So on this slide, we've listed just a handful of the key themes that we saw. I won't go through each today, and this is just a summary of some of the proposals received. All to say that there were many overlapping themes between what was in the surveys and what was in the proposals. We're really looking forward to continuing this conversation with everyone, to begin evaluating all the proposals submitted, and also to hear your feedback on each of them. More to come there. Stay tuned to the GHG Protocol newsletter. All updates will be posted there. And with that, I will hand it back over to David to cover the Scope 3 standard survey feedback.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, so that concludes the corporate standard portion of today's presentation. We'll now turn to the Scope 3 standard and Scope 3 calculation guidance summary of survey feedback and proposals. Just to make clear here, we have two publications on Scope 3, the Corporate Value Chain Scope 3 Accounting and Reporting Standard, or Scope 3 Standard for short, and Technical Guidance for Calculating Scope 3 Emissions, or Scope 3 Calculation Guidance for short. We invited feedback on both of these publications as part of the Scope 3 survey. Next, please. So in terms of top-line findings from the Scope 3 survey, most respondents expressed satisfaction, either somewhat satisfied or very satisfied with the Scope 3 standard and the Scope 3 calculation guidance. Most respondents expressed the need for minor updates to the Scope 3 standard and Scope 3 calculation guidance rather than major updates. Most of the feedback was focused on requests for additional guidance and supporting resources rather than revisions or changes to the standard. Respondents requested additional guidance and clarification, tools, databases, examples, and other types of resources to help facilitate implementation. Respondents also highlighted the need to promote higher quality data and methods in companies reporting on Scope 3 and additional transparency on data and methods used to enable more consistent and comparable greenhouse gas emissions disclosures related to Scope 3. And I will now hand it to my colleague, Alexander Frantzen, to go into more depth on the Scope 3 survey findings.
Thank you, David, for that introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm Alexander. I'm the Scope 3 Senior Associate. Before going into the key topics or findings from the Scope 3 survey, I'd like to provide you this insight regarding the type of requests made by responders. We classified every single response, including subclassifying responses that consisted of, for example, multiple categories, by topic, and then classified it by request type. From this, we found that approximately 2/3 of requests and or feedback from responders could be satisfied by the GHG protocol with either additional guidance and clarification, tools and support, for example, FAQ sections, forum, open sourcing emission factor databases, or alignment, for example, with SBTI, PCAF, ISSB, and other external initiatives. The remaining third of requests could be addressed with either limited optionality, for example, limiting use of the spend-based method or expanding minimum boundaries of categories, making changes to current parts of the standard or calculation guidance, for example, removing the spend-based method, or adding new, for example, calculation or aggregation methods. So please keep this in mind as we go through the key topics. Next slide, please. The following are the key topics from the Scope 3 survey. They are organized in accordance with the chapters of the Scope 3 standard, but include responses from or to both questions concerning the Scope 3 standard and calculation guidance. They are category-specific clarifications, the 15 categories of the Scope 3 standard, boundary considerations, data collection and quality, calculation methods, targets and tracking progress, assurance, reporting and comparability, tools and implementation resources, alignment, and market-based accounting or market-based mechanisms. Let me note that number 3 and 4, data collection quality and calculation methods, are the big two. They accounted for a large fraction of responses, and this can be explained by the fact that the calculation guidance, much of it concerns data collection quality and calculation methods. Next slide, please. First, regarding category-specific clarifications. 2 Scope 3 categories accounted for 30% of category-specific requests for clarification. They are purchased goods and services, category 1, and use of sold products, category 11. Other category topics that came up were capital goods, category 2, regarding considering a depreciation or annual depreciation approach, transportation and distribution, categories 4 and 9, regarding reviewing consistency between GHG Protocol standards and clarifying delineation between upstream and downstream transportation and distribution. Employee commuting, category 7, regarding inclusion of remote work and requiring it as part of the minimum boundary. Circularity, which cuts across various categories, 1, 5, 10, 11, and 12, and concerns, for example, reusing, recycling, repurposing, and extending the lifespan of products. Processing and use of sold products, category 10 and 11, both came up, particularly in the context of long-lived products and considering an annualized inventory approach and guidance with projections and scenarios. Investments, category 15, came up regarding including or adding pension and retirement funds or 401ks, cash holdings, other securities, as well as guidance on facilitated emissions like underwriting, securitization, or other services. As well, guidance for and explicit requirement of category 15 for non-financial institutions was recommended. And finally, reorganizing or retitling certain categories was recommended by a few responders. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, we're on the slide. Regarding boundary considerations. As Steve presented in slide 13 regarding operational boundaries, there was a range of feedback regarding scope 3 boundaries that was mentioned in the the corporate standard. In the scope 3 standard in survey, minimum boundaries across all categories came up consistently in the context of reviewing thresholds for materiality, inclusion and exclusion, and optionality of activities in categories, as well as providing more industry-specific clarity regarding categories to ensure completeness and comparability of GHG inventories. Consolidation approaches came up regarding clarity on the implications for data exchange between companies and comparability. As well, responders requested guidance for intermediaries like commodities traders, distributors, resellers, and marketplaces like e-commerce, as well as services and intangibles, including consulting services, software as a service, SaaS, social media, advertising, and intangibles like licenses and IP. Other activities were listed or mentioned by responders, including donations, travel, and entertainment, and other T&E activities. But we're not going to go through them all here, and this list is not exhaustive, but it will all be included in the written summary. Next slide, please. Regarding data collection and data quality, emission factors was a big topic for many responders, specifically regarding the availability and accessibility of emission factors, which was a key challenge and is a key challenge for many users of the Scope 3 standard. Many requested guidance on using different emission factors, and many recommended developing a consolidated open source emission factor repository, including with EEIO emission factors, spend-based emission factors like EEIO, and other emission factors, which would be managed and updated by GHG Protocol. Data collection and exchange came up as a big topic regarding compiling and assuring supplier-specific or secondary emission factor data, which is a key input, as well as providing guidance on handling activity data cost-effectively and reliably. Many users requested the development of templates, checklists, procedures, and disclaimers for specifically value chain data exchange. In terms of data quality, users requested guidance on managing high and low quality data, including different types of data, for example, supplier-specific data and proxy data, as well as guidance on completeness and accuracy when data quality and methods differ. Users also requested guidance for assessing and quantifying numerically uncertainty. Tools for data management were recommended. For example, programmatic tools to assess the robustness or uncertainty of both input data and results, as well as data quality tiers, a hierarchy or priority matrix to support users in quantifying data quality and uncertainty. Next slide, please. Regarding calculation methods, there were numerous requests for guidance on calculations detailed in the calculation guidance. Users recommended and requested that GHG Protocol update certain methods and or provide practical guidance, for example, case studies or activity examples, which were either industry specific or activity specific to support use of the Scope 3 standard. Many considered or recommended limiting use of the spend-based method, and some recommended to remove it entirely. However, others also recommended or warned against removing the spend-based method. So it was not a unanimous recommendation, or the feedback was not unanimous regarding that specific method. Regarding combining methods, users requested guidance on calculating or aggregating results when different calculation methods are used. They requested more guidance on modeling or projecting downstream emissions in the absence of primary data, and clarity on the implications for benchmarking, comparability, and rebaselining. Several users recommended limiting, phasing out, and or removing unreliable methods entirely, for example, the spend-based method. And some users recommended new methods, for example, real-time data. Allocation was a big topic, and many users requested guidance on choosing and combining allocation methods, for example, physical allocation methods or economic allocation methods, and also requested guidance on allocating embodied emissions of capital equipment, co-products, and co-packaging or bundling, as well as shared activities. Next slide, please. Users requested feedback on targets and tracking progress. This includes key performance indicators, specifically clarity on the implications of inclusion, exclusion, data quality, calculation methods, and accuracy for target setting and tracking progress. Users or responders also requested more guidance on developing reliable internal KPIs for performance tracking. For example, greenhouse gas or CO2 emissions per product, emissions per customer, or emissions per sale, per dollar sale, as well as guidance on tracking progress as data quality and calculation methods improve over time. Again, many users expressed concern that reliance on the spend-based method was unreliable for tracking purposes, and that method had limited use beyond proxy or hotspot identification, despite the widespread use. Regarding benchmarks, many responders identified the need for credible category and industry-specific benchmarks, as well as guidance on using regional or proxy data to benchmark activities, products, and/or companies. Users also requested guidance on removals, offsets, and credits. Many responders requested the development of tools to help companies track company level and product level performance. And many requested that GHG Protocol provide more guidance, for example, examples or case studies for greenhouse gas emission reduction opportunities that companies can utilize before going into or using contractual instruments, i.e. market-based mechanisms. Also, responders requested guidance on quantifying and reporting avoided emissions and distinguishing it or including it in impact assessments. Next slide, please. Regarding assurance reporting and comparability, verification and assurance was identified as a challenge regarding inputs, calculation methods, greenhouse gas inventories, allocation methods, and final reports or final GHG inventories. Many requested guidance on value chain assurance and general enforcement of standard compliance to ensure high quality to ensure the accuracy of GHG inventories and the value of data. The cross comparability was a big issue raised by users. Many requested guidance on how to cross compare inventories from different vendors or companies. And responders requested templates and checklists for reviewing, for example, GHG inventories or emission results between companies and products, and guidance on making performance claims. Regarding reporting requirements, many responders requested that reporting requirements be made stricter, for example, by making 11.2 optional information required. And many recommended improvements to disclosure, or recommended requiring improved disclosure of all relevant information, including calculation methods, data quality, reliability, and uncertainty, to support companies in interpreting GHG emission or inventories. Regarding reporting templates, several responders suggested GHG Protocol provide reporting templates for disclosing GHG inventories, as well as performance metrics, and the development of templates for communicating uncertainty, disclaimers, disclosures, and other valuable or relevant information regarding GHG inventories. Next slide, please. Regarding tools and implementation resources, many responders requested the development of and pointed out existing tools and support, including GHG Protocol should expand their FAQs, add a forum, include a larger tools library that has, for example, emission factor databases, and also the development of online training, coursework, more examples, more case studies, etc., to support standard implementation, building out or expanding use of the build out of the GHG Protocol review services. And many requested that the Scope 3 evaluator, also known as the Quantis tool, be updated with relevant or up-to-date spend-based emission factors. Other calculators, estimators, or proxy tools and data quality review tools were recommended. Secondly, industry-specific guidance was a broad topic across the entire survey, across all survey responses. Many responders requested general best practice implementation, standard compliance, and other consistency information or other support with consistency across categories for their industry. They also suggested developing either indexes or mappings of categories by business activity that are industry specific to support industry specific category classification, as well as alignment with external industry specific technical guidance documents. Next slide, please. Regarding alignment, many responders requested or suggested that GHG Protocol do more to align our Scope 3 standard and other standards and guidance documents with external standards, frameworks, and guidance documents. The most often mentioned external climate program or framework was the Science-Based Targets Initiative. Following that, PCAF was mentioned often in the context of supporting Category 15 investments, and responders requested either that GHG Protocol expand Category 15 guidance or align with PCAF. The International Organization for Standardization, or ISO, standards and guidance documents were referenced, as was the ISSB, or International Sustainability Standards Board's documents, as well as pending and future regulations like CSRD. As Steve mentioned earlier in the presentation regarding the corporate standard, greater alignment between GHG Protocol standards and guidance documents was mentioned in the Scope 3 survey responses, as it was in the corporate standard response. Biogenic emissions and removals was also mentioned in the context of aligning with the land sector and removals guidance being developed by GHG Protocol. Next slide, please. Market-based mechanisms was a big topic in the Scope 3 survey. However, the market-based accounting approaches, as was introduced by David earlier in the presentation, is being considered by a separate survey and review process. We will review the role of Scope 2 market-based accounting for value chain activities, and that will be addressed in consultation with Scope 2, with the Scope 2 workstream. Here I list some of the various types of credits or contractual instruments that were brought up by responders in the Scope 3 survey. Next slide, please. Finally, we received a lot of Scope 3 proposals, and the topics largely mirror those of the survey summary, which I've just outlined, and many of which further are available online for you to review. They include, for example, in purchase goods and services, digital services, agricultural biogenic removals, and market-based mechanisms in the value chain upstream, as well as in category 5 and 12, waste generated operations and end-of-life treatment of sold products. Waste to energy was brought up, as were bio-based and recycled materials. Pension and retirement funds proposals were made and guidance on including that and whether or not to, for example, align with PCAF, as well as the long-lived products or how to account for long-lived products in category 11. And there were other categories and general topics which we will outline in the written summary, which we expect to release in the coming weeks. And with that, that concludes the Scope 3 survey response summary, and I'm going to pass it back to David.
Great, thank you, Alexander. So now we'll conclude with next steps before we move to the Q&A portion of the webinar. Next, please. So on next steps, first of all, just clarify, we will send the webinar recording and slides to participants after the webinar. We will also be producing written summaries of both the corporate standard and Scope 3 survey feedback and share that online and with our newsletter list in the coming weeks. We've now presented on 3 of the 4 survey findings through webinars, and we'll have one more webinar on the market-based approaches survey in around a month or so from now, and more information on registering for that webinar will be circulated to our newsletter list in a couple of weeks. In terms of the process to produce the updated guidance, we are now developing work plans and forming governance bodies informed by the survey feedback. We will then move to the multi-stakeholder process to develop and update standards and guidance in the beginning of the year, and have a 2-year timeline with draft updates available in 1 year is the aim, and final updates within 2 years. If you're not already subscribed to our newsletter list and you would like to receive updates, please subscribe to our email list at the URL on the screen, and you'll be kept up to date on all future developments. And with that, we can move to the Q&A portion of the webinar. Thank you to all of you for your attention. Thank you to all the speakers today. And we've received a number of questions through the Q&A, which we will try to answer as many as we can. There were a few questions on process, including how people can get involved in the process to update the standards. I'll just read a couple of the questions we got. Will there be a call for interest to participate in the governance of the project? Is there a possibility to get involved and follow updates? How will the technical working groups be formed? How can I participate? And I'd like to pass it to Pankaj to answer those questions. Thanks.
Thank you, David. And thank you, everyone, for those who submitted these questions on the governance and process. As I said in my opening remarks, we are right now in the planning phase of our governing bodies. There will be 3 major governing bodies: the steering committee, the independent standards board, and the technical working groups. We envision that each of the 4 work streams will likely have their own technical working groups. Now, the questions about how do we engage and how do we participate in these different bodies, and particularly, I think some of you have expressed interest in joining the technical working groups, and we welcome your interest and would really like you to consider submitting your applications. There will be an open process for the recruitment. We plan to bring an independent recruitment agency who will help in managing this process. We think that the first step will be the initial setup of the steering committee and the independent standards board. And I think the working group process will come after the initial setup has been done of the steering committee and independent standards board. So there will be a time lag, and we will also, we are right now finalizing the application process and criteria for technical working group. It will be an open process, but we also have to finalize the application process, criteria and qualifications, then have consultations with the steering committee and ISP, and then we open the call for applications for the technical working groups. And so those who are interested should stay tuned for more details, either through our newsletter or the GHG Protocol website. Thank you.
Thank you. I see a few questions about training resources. We have on our website, we have online training courses for our various standards and guidance. I included a link in one of the responses to the question in the Q&A section. We are in the process of updating and enhancing some of the courses there, and we will ensure that the courses are aligned with any updates once they're produced in the future. In terms of in-person trainings, I think that's something we will consider in the future based on needs and our team's capacity to deliver. In the meantime, the e-learning format is what we're focusing on at the moment, and we have courses available that people can access. There were also a few questions about the treatment of secondhand goods, used goods, circularity, questions along those lines. So I wanted to pass it to Alexander to address the circularity question. Thanks.
Yeah, circularity was a very high level classification of the range of topics that came up regarding incentivizing reuse, repurposing, recycling of materials. There were requests to reconsider the incentive, whether or not the standard supported circularity in all its forms as best possible, including long-lived products, which was one of the most often mentioned topics in category 11, use of sold product. Many users thought that accounting for emissions on a cumulative basis did not make it possible to display the emissions saved from per use of sold product. As other topics that came up were bio-based materials, waste to energy, and just generally incentivizing circularity. So those are some of the other sort of topics that came up regarding circularity, but certainly we are definitely going to take a close look at figuring out how the standard can support accounting for those types of activities as best possible. Thanks.
Thank you. There were a few questions about biogenic carbon, biogenic CO2 emissions. This is a topic that's being addressed through the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Land Sector and Removals Guidance, which has been under development for about 3 years and will be published next year. So that guidance is addressing land sector impacts, land management, emissions, land use change, biogenic CO2, CO2 removals from either biogenic or technological removals. So there's a whole set of issues that are being addressed through that separate process. The rest of the corporate level standards will then align with the approaches that have been developed through that separate process. So I would refer you to the land sector and removals guidance if you have further questions about the treatment of biogenic carbon. The market-based approach has been brought up a few times. We hear a lot of demand for addressing market-based mechanisms. The fourth and the next webinar we'll do will be on this topic specifically. We had a survey to collect input related to market-based approaches. So the next webinar will go into that in a lot more depth. So I think best to just wait for that, and just to say that we plan to address it through this separate work stream on market-based approaches, but of course there are a lot of linkages with the other work streams on corporate standard, scope 2 and scope 3, and it'll be a coordinated effort to have these 4 work streams coordinated and aligned. I will ask the team if anyone on the team is seeing questions that anyone would like to come in and answer.
David, I can answer a couple of questions. There is a question on harmonization, and actually a very good question on whether we still see different standards, so to speak, at least in namesake, and whether those could be all merged into one. So there are a couple of responses here. One, fortunately, most of these standards, I think, are different labels, but at the foundation, they all follow the GHG protocol. So for example, ISSB has recently issued a standard, and for emissions disclosure, corporate emissions disclosure, they require GHG protocol be followed. And they even require, actually, they go further than the current GHG protocol standard, and they require scope 3 reporting. And so, so I would say there's no difference there. If you are thinking also like CDP, SPTI, they all, for accounting, they follow the GHG protocol standards. ISO also follows. ISO in its new set of revisions is likely to go back to the terminology that they were using in their earlier version, which is the scopes terminology, so that they are also fully aligned in terms of these major concepts and definitions. There is also one other question on ISO, and I don't know if we have Amir from WBCST. If Amir is here, and I would like him to answer that question about collaboration with ISO. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pankaj. Yes, unfortunately, I cannot turn on my camera, but welcome to everyone, to all the participants, and thank you for this question. Firstly, to emphasize that I think it was emphasized in the beginning of this presentation that one of the main aims of this update is indeed harmonization, and ISO comes as one of the natural standards that we should work with. We have had a few communications, and we are in a course of a number of communications with ISO, specifically related harmonization of our greenhouse gas protocol standard at the corporate level, and their counterparts of corporate standards such as ISO 14064 series, as well as any related other standards such as on the product level ISO 14067. We are in communication with ISO on this matter, and we will share our updates as we go forward from both our sides, from both greenhouse gas protocol as well as an ISO, in terms of how that collaboration is going, as well as a number of opportunities for joint collaboration and harmonized standards as we go forward. So please stay tuned as we also keep you updated with our updates process. Thanks.
Thank you, Amir. Let's see. Anybody on the team would like to come in, please feel free to do so.
I did see one question concerning whether or not we're going to review what was raised as an issue by many responders concerning double counting. As the scope 3 expert, I love double counting, but we will certainly provide more guidance regarding double counting and how this may or may not align with financial accounting practices, which by their nature do not have double counting or correct for it. And so, but we will address and provide more guidance on why there is double counting and how the market can understand double counting in the scope 3 standard. if it wasn't listed in our survey results. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, and I can take it from the corporate standard lens. Part of the feedback we received on boundaries is to try to distinguish between direct and indirect emissions for certain relationships, such as leased assets, franchises, licenses. So we're hoping that potentially clarifying or really giving more guidance on how to determine your direct and indirect emissions in those relationships will in fact reduce any double counting or missed emissions in that regard too.
Thank you. There's a couple questions about emission factors. Is it possible that GHG Protocol provides an emission factor database in the future? We do currently provide emission factors on our website. I'll send links to two of the resources on our website. We have emission factors that we compile from sources like IPCC and EPA and UK DEFRA for direct emissions mainly, but also electricity. And we also have a website that lists third-party life cycle databases that can be used for Scope 3 calculations. I've just linked to both of those on our website. So those are available. As part of this update process, we will of course reconsider producing new data sources, new tools, new resources. But in the meantime, I just wanted to make people aware that we have them now. We're also going through a process to just update and make sure that the emission factors we have are the latest and up-to-date versions, and that will be happening over the next few months. So now I'll also ask the team if there's any other questions you've seen come in the last few minutes.
Yes, David, thank you. I think one other important question, very good questions, actually. So many, so many of the questions we may not be able to answer in this call, but if at all possible for you, also please feel free to connect with us by email. And once the detailed summary document is published, if there are some additional topics that you don't see in those summaries, you want to submit them, that could be a good opportunity as well. But what I wanted to address, looking at some of the questions, is I think, for example, if companies that are planning to follow SBTi and want to submit to SBTi their goals, should they wait or for the updates, or can they start now? I would say they should not wait. And I think as a general understanding, at least from my personal viewpoint, what I can see, and I could be wrong, and maybe this is yet to be fully investigated, but I don't think we are seeing any major changes to the basic framework of the GHG Protocol Corporate Accounting and Reporting Standard and the Scope 3 standard. I think if you also make an assessment based on a very good high-level overview provided by colleagues here, that most of the feedback, I think, is asking for more guidance and more clarity. But it seems, for example, the Scope 3 15 categories framework, I don't see anybody questioning that. And so I think generally speaking, that framework has stood the test of the time. That reflects the life cycle accounting approach. And similar to life cycle accounting, it is solid, in my view. Although we may be providing more guidance in terms of subcategories and more organization in terms of subcategories, a question has come up a few times on defining significance. And like that, I think several other questions that pertain to looking for more guidance on many, many different topics. Alexander presented and Steve presented. So the guidance part, I think, is a continuing work. But the framework, if the frameworks are going to stay the same, I think my suggestion would be that companies who are looking to join the SBTi, they should not wait. They should use the current framework. In any case, the current framework is the official standard. So you will be in compliance if you follow the current framework. And I think the future versions may give some more guidance and clarity, and maybe more complete inventories will be happening because of that. More accurate inventories will be happening because of that. But I think the general framework of corporate accounting and reporting standard and scope 3 standard will stay the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Pankaj. I think that was a very good concluding remarks, and we're at time. So thank you everyone for joining. Thank you for all your questions. We'll review them afterwards for the ones we weren't able to address live. And we will follow up with the recording, the slides, the written summaries will be coming in a few weeks' time. And as I've said, the market-based approaches webinar will be the next one that we'll hold soon. So with that, thank you so much, and we will be in touch. Thank you.
Thank you.